Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the James Wilson Annual Lecture, sponsored by the Institute of Legal and Constitutional Research here at the University of St. Andrews. My name is Tony Lang. I'm a professor in the School of International Relations and on the steering committee of the Institute. We're really pleased today to have Professor William Ewald as our first James Wilson lecture. Now, normally I would explain who James Wilson is, but I don't think I need to do that this time because the title of our lecture is The Forgetting of James Wilson, and we have the world's leading expert on James Wilson here with us today. So he'll be able to tell you much more about James Wilson than I ever could. But let me tell you just for a minute something about Bill just to introduce him. So he's I would certainly say what we would call a Renaissance man in his background. So Bill earned his doctorate in mathematical logic, of all things, at Oxford University before attending Harvard Law School. And he's actually unlike many of us, he continues to work in both fields. So Bill has actually published a really important source book from Kant to Hilbert on the philosophy of mathematics, and is actually on this individual, David Hilbert, who I don't know a lot about, the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, is publishing his papers in a series of volumes that are continuing to come out. But we're not going to have Bill speak to us about mathematics today. He's going to speak to us about James Wilson, and he is an internationally recognized scholar in legal philosophy and comparative law. He's got a terrific, very long journal article called "What Was It Like to Try a Rat?", which is a really foundational piece in comparative legal studies and comparative jurisprudence. And as Bill's background, in looking over his background, it seems led him to the study of James Wilson, who was, I should say about Wilson, the first professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, where Bill currently is. So today, and Bill has published two really important articles on Wilson and his role in the founding. So Bill is a professor of law and philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And as I said, we're very, very pleased to have him giving the first annual James Wilson lecture. And just let me say before I turn it over to Bill that Bill will speak for about 50 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have questions, which we would ask you to post in the chat function on Teams, and I'll moderate those and pass them along to Bill. But let me now turn it over to Bill for his lecture, The Forgetting of James Wilson. Bill.
Thank you, Tony. So there's a lot to cover. And let me start right in. So there is Wilson himself, his dates. First date, somewhat approximate. Second date, rather sad, as I'll say in a moment, but much more precise. Let me first, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to treat this as a lecture for the uninitiated public. So as the title implies, Wilson is not a well-known figure. I want to describe who he was, what he did, and then something about the rediscovery of Wilson, in particular, the way in which I happened to get interested in him and what now seems to me to be an accurate statement of his historical place. Towards the end, I'll get a little bit more technical and say some things about the connection to the scholarship that's now being done at St. Andrews. Caroline, John Hudson, the sort of CL group, there actually turns out to be a very direct link to Wilson. But biography first. So Wilson was born in Scotland, little town village called Carscardo, a few miles to the west of St. Andrews. He studied at St. Andrews in the late 1750s, early 1760s, precise dates a little bit unclear. He may also have studied at Glasgow. That's important because he would have been there at the same time as either or both of Adam Smith and Thomas Reed. He then, 1765, got on a ship, emigrated to British North America, ended up in Pennsylvania, at first on the frontier, didn't much like his initial work, which was teaching Latin at the ancestor school of the University of Pennsylvania. So he decided to go in for legal studies. And quite luckily for him, he apprenticed himself to John Dickinson. Dickinson, known as the penman of the American Revolution. This is just as things are getting heated up. If you look at those dates, 1765, that's the date of the Stamp Act crisis. Dickinson was absolutely in the thick of revolutionary politics, of defending the colonial cause, and young Mr. Wilson was studying at his feet. He then, after finishing up his apprenticeship, it took him a surprisingly short period of time, 1768, 1769, he goes out to the Pennsylvania frontier. He's a frontier practicing lawyer. When the revolution starts going in earnest, he is then recruited to the Pennsylvania delegation to the Continental Congress. He signs the Declaration of Independence in 1776, moves back to the city of Philadelphia, where he remains for the rest of his life. 1787, he is named one of Pennsylvania's delegates to the Constitutional Convention. He signs that document as well. There are only a half dozen people who signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. Remember, what happened inside the Constitutional Convention was a tightly held secret, so nobody had any idea what any of the participants did. All they had was the signatures on the final document. He was clearly appreciated. George Washington appointed him one of the first justices of the Supreme Court. He was in the very first group of appointees. Things seemed to be going extremely well for him. His financial dealings, he invested heavily in Western land. That all seemed to be going nicely. And then disaster struck. He went bankrupt. His land speculations did not succeed. And in the 18th century, if you went bankrupt, you went to debtor's prison. So James Wilson has the ignominious distinction of being the only justice of the United States Supreme Court ever to go to prison, which that did not help his reputation terribly much. It was something of an embarrassment. In the aftermath of the revolution, people were looking for heroic figures they could put up on a marble pedestal. Wilson, because of his disgraceful death, really did not qualify. And there were some other things. His papers went, so in kind of the general chaos of his death, his remaining papers went to his son, then to his granddaughter, Emily Hollingsworth. As an old lady, she donated her grandfather's papers to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. There's a rather interesting interchange. She sends the papers, and it says, you know, there's a really interesting letter from George Washington there appointing my grandfather to the Supreme Court. Well, historically, that's of very little interest. The head of the Historical Society writes back to her and says, you know, dear Miss Hollingsworth, this seems a kind of thin collection. Do you have any more papers? And she sends the rest and says, you know, if you can't use this stuff, feel free to throw it out. I don't have any particular need for it. She didn't quite realize that she was handing over the first drafts of the US Constitution and some extremely important documents connected to the Declaration. Okay. By about the year 2000, so this is the time that I showed up at the Penn Law School, actually a few years before that. Essentially, there was very, very little discussed about Wilson. Even at Penn, his collected papers, they had disappeared from the library long since. I asked several of my colleagues, you know, who's this person? His name was up on the building. Who's James Wilson? Most people said, you know, don't really know. He signed the Declaration and the Constitution, but apart from that, seems kind of a minor, unimportant figure. There was a biography by somebody named Burton Conkle. Conkle assembled a whole lot of material, then died before he could publish the biography. There were a couple of other somewhat problematic later biographical studies, but not really going into the intellectual history. Handful of articles, and then something that for me was quite important. Gary Wills wrote this book in the late 1970s, pointing out the ways in which the Scottish Enlightenment had influenced Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. So as Tony was saying at the beginning, I work in comparative law, teach comparative law, and I had this rather kind of question that had been kind of nagging at me. In American law schools, one talks all the time about the common law Anglo-American roots of the American legal system. Anybody who does comparative law understands Scotland, especially in the 18th century, was not a common law system. It was a civil law system. So it occurred to me, look at this obscure figure, James Wilson. Nobody knows much about him, so there isn't a whole lot that I'm going to have to read, and just see, can I pin down any sort of civil law influences on the drafting of the US Constitution? So you have somebody who's trained in Scotland. Maybe there's something there. It will make a nice short article. It will get the dean off my back. Be one more publication. So I thought, fine, I'll tackle that nicely defined little problem. And now let me, just to structure what I'm about to say, I'm going to be talking actually about three things. So Constitutional Convention, which is where I started, then Wilson's contributions to the Declaration of Independence. That's not a typo there saying 1774. I know 1776 is when the Declaration was signed, but 1774 is actually the important date. And then finally, I will want to say something about the lectures on law that Wilson delivered at the University of Pennsylvania in 1790. So this is after he's been appointed to the Supreme Court, after all the work at the Constitutional Convention. And it's those lectures that have the rather direct tie-in to the current project at St. Andrews of studying common law, civil law, and canon law. Okay, Constitutional Convention. So let's start as follows. The basic timeline, just to remind you of how the Constitutional Convention proceeded. This is the standard story. So I'm taking it from a classic book by Clinton Rossiter, published about 60 some odd years ago. At the beginning, you have this nationalist period where James Madison tables the Virginia Plan. That's a plan that favored the big states. The nationalists, the big states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, they are pushing for Madison's plan until in the middle of June, New Jersey pops up and they say, no, we've got a different plan that will favor the small states. That plan is beaten back. Hamilton makes an important speech, and then you move into a sustained period of very, very bitter argument. It's a long, almost a month-long debate between the big states and the small states, and they are fighting back and forth, tooth and nail. Finally, middle of July, they reach what's known as the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise actually was not much of a compromise. Madison and Wilson lost that argument. The real debate was over representation in the Senate, but it was called a compromise. Things were papered over. The convention by that point was absolutely exhausted, totally worn out, so they took a break for about 10 days. There was a small committee called the Committee of Detail. Their assignment was take all the things that we've agreed to so far, put them together into a coherent form. We'll come back in August. August, the debates resume. They go on for another month. and they revolve around things like the issue of protections for slavery, around the design of the presidency. All kinds of minor miscellaneous provisions are being debated back and forth. The Electoral College dates to this time. Rossiter calls his chapter on that period sort of details, details, details. Basically, people were kind of tired, and Madison's notes sort of peter out, and it's a not remarkably interesting part of the entire time. Then, middle of September, the Committee of Style puts together the final constitution, and the convention comes to an end. Okay, so that's the basic standard timeline. Now, during that debate, you have Wilson and Madison. They are the two delegates from the biggest states. They're the two most active delegates from Virginia and Pennsylvania. They are close allies throughout this 5, 6, 7 week period, debating the large state versus the small state position. Everybody knows, or everybody assumes, James Madison was the father of the Constitution, the most important delegate in Philadelphia. The standard histories categorize Wilson as Madison's ablest supporter. That's Max Farrand, the great scholar of the convention, writing in 1913. That view persists throughout the 20th century. My colleague at Penn, Rick Beeman, wrote a wonderful study of the convention that came out in 2009. He categorized Wilson the same way essentially as Farrand, as a helper. He is an adjunct to Madison, not really independently terribly interesting, very, very loyal, supportive of Madison's position, but he's in the second tier of delegates. Okay, so I thought, fine, I can live with that, but still I'd like to know just exactly what Wilson did, and started methodically plotting my way through Farrand's records of the Constitutional Convention. So this is 2 large volumes. It's about 1,000 pages altogether, and you read through the debates slowly, and I filtered out everything except Madison and Wilson. I just wanted to know, okay, what exactly is the relation between those two? The first thing that you notice really within the first several days of the convention is that Madison and Wilson, yes, they agree on their conclusions. The philosophical arguments they're making are extremely different, very, very different. Wilson essentially, and oversimplifying somewhat, Wilson's position is it's a democratic, one man, one vote, one citizen, one vote, democratic view of things. Madison is more, it's a Republican, let's have a filtration. Yes, there are to be democratic elements, but we want to control the democracy and make sure it doesn't go off the rails. They do agree, but they agree for quite different underlying reasons. And as a philosopher, I found that quite striking and worthy of note in its own right. But then there's something else. So as you methodically go through, you go through the first volume of Farrand, and by the time you get to the end, you see really the differences are quite far-reaching, the intellectual differences. But then you hit the Committee of Detail. Now, the Committee of Detail I knew nothing about, absolutely nothing, but hit the relevant passage in Farrand, and there's a little footnote saying the Committee of Detail, there are these manuscripts, they're all in the handwriting of James Wilson. I thought, oh, good heavens, what do we do now? You've got this long segment that's in Wilson's handwriting with Madison not in the room. So kind of crucial point. If you look at the Committee of Detail, it contains 5 members. Okay, there's one from Massachusetts, one from Connecticut, Wilson from Pennsylvania, Edmund Randolph from Virginia, and John Rutledge from South Carolina. So those are the 5. They're in the room. Madison is nowhere to be seen. Okay, so better take a close look. Well, the Committee of Detail, as it prints up in Farrand, it fills roughly 40 pages. If you're looking at Farrand pages and looking at the productivity of the convention, the Virginia plan that they start with, that's 3 pages long in the standard printing. By the time you get to the end of July, after 2 full months of work, you're up to 6 pages. So the convention, in 2 months, they've added 3 pages to the collection. The report of the Committee of Detail is 12 pages long. Okay, this is a vast amount of increased text, constitutional text, all being done in secret, this little committee in 1 week. The remaining days add a further 3 pages. So it was clear very quickly once I started looking at it, okay, this Committee of Detail, this looks really pretty important. If you look in the monograph literature for substantial discussions of the Committee of Detail, basically it's Beeman's book. He devotes 6 pages total to the Committee of Detail. This is something that fills 40 pages in Farrand. He doesn't go into the mechanics of what the committee actually did. He reports on a bit of the back and forth. So, okay, I figured I'd better take a close look at this thing. And the problem is, you've got to get into the manuscripts. So here is this is a image of one of the pages from the Committee of Detail. This is mostly in Edmund Randolph's handwriting for one of the drafts, but you can see it's something of a mess. When Farrand printed that page, he printed it up very cleanly like this, so that you can't figure out who was writing what and just what exactly was happening behind closed doors. Once you edit it properly and print it out so that you can see what's been crossed out, what are the changes, what's the committee actually up to, you can start making sense out of what the committee did. Now, so I ended up writing a monograph length article. It's about 100 pages trying to reconstruct what went on behind the closed doors of this committee. But let me just give you the capsule view. So Constitution has 3 primary articles. Article 1 dealing with Congress. The Committee of Detail did the enumeration of federal powers. It did the necessary and proper clause, the supremacy clause making the Constitution supreme over the law of the states, and the constitutional restrictions on what the state can and cannot do. The Committee of Detail also wrote much of Article 2 dealing with the presidency. They didn't do the Electoral College, that was left for later, but much of the powers of the presidency, those were specified in the Committee of Detail. They essentially were completely responsible for Article 3, the jurisdiction of the federal courts. Okay, now for law professors, you'll recognize essentially what I'm saying here is the Committee of Detail wrote the Constitution in about a week. These 3 things, those are the core of the US Constitution. The matters that were being debated in the great debate over representation in the Senate, much less significant from the point of view of constitutional law. So, okay, that's very surprising, quite interesting. The committee also dealt with the issue of slavery. Now, I got into looking at the Committee of Detail because I was researching Wilson. I had initially hoped to be able to show James Wilson wrote the Constitution inside the Committee of Detail. I think that's possible. He's the smartest legal intellect on that committee, but you've got to stop short of making that conclusion for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of the stuff that appears in his handwriting, it's things that he clearly disagreed with. including the provisions dealing with slavery. So you can't infer from the fact that the drafts are in his handwriting that he was actually the person composing the provisions. That said, I think there's every reason to think that he was the primary intellect behind most of what the Committee of Detail did. It can't be nailed down with absolute certainty. You have to do a lot of back and forth triangulating him against the other members of the committee. He's certainly a central figure. And if you take that together with what we have from the rest of the convention, you come to the fairly surprising conclusion that he's at least as important at the convention as James Madison. Whether he's more important, that I don't think is a particularly fruitful argument to have, but certainly as important when you figure out the contributions of the Committee of Detail. Now, there's a very good reason for not employing the term Father of the Constitution for anybody. So Nicholas Cole at Oxford has this wonderful website in which he has put in all the records of the Constitutional Convention. Here's his map of the principal decision points. Basically, the convention, it has several thousand decision points. No single person could have kept track of everything that was going on. Wilson's important, Madison's important. It's best, I think, just drop the idea of a single father of the Constitution. It's a myth, and it doesn't really help you to understand what happened. Okay, so if you're looking at Wilson at the convention, in contrast to the picture that sees Wilson just simply as a supporter of Madison, a kind of adjunct, you've got to put his work on the Committee of Detail, his work on the presidency, where he's clearly the principal architect, his theoretical arguments, which place him closer to the actual Constitution. So if you look at the document that actually emerges from the Constitution, it's closer to Wilson than it is to Madison or Gouverneur Morris or Alexander Hamilton. He didn't get everything that he wanted, but he got most of what he was looking for. He also, more than Madison, I think, anticipated the democratic politics of the 19th century, the one man, one vote, frontier democracy. That's much more Wilson than it is anybody else at the convention. Okay, so that's my first set of conclusions were about Wilson at the convention. By the time I'd reached this stage, I realized, okay, this is not just simply an article. This is going to be, it's going to be a book. There's going to have to be a biographical study. I'm going to have to get into the lecture notes on law. I'm going to have to get into what he did during the ratification debates. The project has now started to take over my life. This is around, oh, what's the year now? Maybe 2012, something like that. And one of the things that I did going into the Wilson archives was get scans of a lot of his manuscripts. And I understood that he played a role in 1776 and 1774, and that was going to have to be dealt with. And there was an important manuscript that I will tell you about in a second. But let me first just say a little something about why I'm focusing on the date 1774. That's because of this rather annoying thing. There was a Broadway musical that came out at around the time of the bicentennial called 1776. Wilson appears in that musical. The musical is about the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, and Wilson is he's the goat. He's the cowardly figure who can't make up his mind, and at the very end, he agrees to, so he's being tugged back and forth. John Dickinson does not want to declare independence. Ben Franklin does want to declare independence. Wilson's torn, he can't make up his mind, and finally he decides, I'll sign the document because I want to go along with the crowd and nobody will notice me, so I don't want, as the script says, I'm different from most of the men here. I don't want to be remembered. I just don't want the responsibility. And Dickinson speaks back to Wilson and says, well, is that how new nations are formed? By a non-entity trying to preserve the anonymity he so richly deserves. Okay, that's the Hollywood account of James Wilson, 1776. 1776 is therefore a somewhat painful date. So let's move back 2 years. 1774. This is a very nice story. So 1774, just remember the context. Boston Tea Party, that had happened the previous December. There was a crisis in Massachusetts. The British government imposed the coercive acts, the intolerable acts, sent troops to occupy the city of Boston. That provoked a continent-wide crisis. The First Continental Congress met in September to discuss what to do. So the representatives from all the colonies showed up in Philadelphia beginning on September the 5th. There had been a long-standing pamphlet debate. This is what Bernard Bailyn made his reputation studying. It was very much a British argument. The colonists were viewing themselves as adherents of the British Constitution. But then in September, you get these two quite remarkable pamphlets. The first appears a little bit before the convention meets. That appears in Virginia in early August. It's the summary view of the rights of British America. It was published anonymously, as you can see, because this is his copy. Thomas Jefferson was actually the author, published in Williamsburg. Jefferson's pamphlet was brought by his friends to Philadelphia without his, well, he was not himself in Philadelphia, but the pamphlet, it was taken to Philadelphia, it was reprinted, it was widely circulated. It caused quite a splash. He was arguing now very, very vehemently against British policy, at times going quite overboard to the point of almost, you read it in retrospect, you have this quote about Americans being forbidden to make fur hats from an animal killed perhaps on his own plantation, and he calls that an instance of despotism to which no parallel can be produced in the most arbitrary ages of British history, which that's an exaggeration. He also, quite strikingly, towards the end of the pamphlet, takes this radical position, which is that the British Parliament has no authority, full stop, to exercise authority over the North American colonies. So that claim Jefferson makes, he doesn't supply legal argument, he doesn't go into, he just simply states it. That's my view. Okay, so you have this quite angry pamphlet, September 5th, it's circulating, and it makes this dramatic, shocking claim. 3 weeks later, you got another pamphlet, about 30 pages long. September 28th is when it appears. It's this thing, Considerations on the Nature and the Extent of the Legislative Authority of the British Parliament. Okay, so it's directly on what Jefferson had been talking about. It's quite different. It's much cooler, much more analytical. It is an extended analysis of the central question that Jefferson had only stated a conclusion, namely, what is the authority of Parliament? And it's philosophically quite remarkable. So what it does, it doesn't argue directly about the British Constitution. It steps back, it moves into political philosophy. It attacks the Blackstone conception of the British Constitution, the new conception of parliamentary sovereignty. It does it using a lot of 18th century continental natural law arguments. The pamphlet kind of lands smack in the middle of the First Continental Congress, 3 weeks after Jefferson, and it's anonymous. So, okay, people wondered who wrote this thing. Who could be the author? It's clearly a brilliant piece of work. And there was, now you can't, this is much too small for you to read it, but this is the Rivington's Gazette. This was a somewhat loyalist newspaper published in New York, but circulated throughout the Northeast. Over to the left, next to that square, it says the celebrated Dr. Franklin's considerations, blah, blah, blah. Okay, Rivington assigned the thing, said Benjamin Franklin is the author of that pamphlet that everybody's talking about. Now, Franklin, at this point, he was the most famous human being in the Western Hemisphere. People had been wondering for many months, when is Franklin going to speak out? When is he going to publicly state his views? The view in the pamphlet, people thought, okay, that sounds like Franklin. It's certainly a brilliant piece of writing. The attribution to Franklin, that appeared towards the end of the Congress. Everybody who was meeting in Philadelphia saw it. Everybody thought this pamphlet, Benjamin Franklin wrote this thing. We damn well better read it closely because Franklin is important. It was circulated to London. Josiah Tucker wrote a response. And then several weeks later, there was this anonymous letter that appeared in the Gazette, almost certainly either written by Franklin or written by somebody close to him. So he wanted to distance himself from this. So the letter says, Mr. Rivington, you've been misinformed in attributing to Dr. Benjamin Franklin the piece entitled Considerations on the Extent of the Authority. Franklin's political principles are quite different. That gentleman always acknowledged that Great Britain had a right to regulate our trade. Okay, so Franklin in 1774, he's saying this is too hot for me to handle. I need to back off. And he says the real author of that performance is Mr. Wilson of this province, i.e. Pennsylvania, a native of Scotland and a warm patriot. All right, so publicly identified James Wilson. He's now, he's still quite a young man, unknown, writes this pamphlet. It's attributed to the most famous person, as I say, in the Western Hemisphere. Okay. Now, neither Wilson nor Jefferson attended the first Congress. They were both at the second, which is the one that leads up to the Declaration of Independence. But let's stick with 1774 because there's something quite important about the considerations. Wilson, as I say, he moves onto the ground of natural rights philosophy. He makes this, it's quite a deft argument, and there's this important paragraph towards the beginning, which here you have it. I won't read it, you can read it more quickly than I can read it out loud, but this should remind you of something. The emphasis on all men are by nature equal. The happiness of the society is the first law of every government. The emphasis on consent and increasing the happiness of the government, the happiness of the governed. That's the famous preamble to the Declaration of Independence. Those are the arguments that are being made here. The striking thing is, if you look at Jefferson's early writings, you can't find any trace of a similar argument. Okay? This is not, so Jefferson in the summary view, Jefferson in all of his early writings, so there's one volume. Now, Jefferson's papers, there was a fire and a lot of the early papers got lost. What remains shows not a chemical trace of this particular argument. The original rough draft, I won't go through the analysis, but it's kind of clumsy, and it then went back into committee for further editing. Now, if you look at the committee that drafted the Declaration, so Jefferson was the principal author. There were 5 members of the committee. 3 members of the committee, one was Franklin. Franklin certainly knew the Jefferson pamphlet. Absolutely no question, the pamphlet was attributed to him. So of course he read it. He read it very closely. John Adams, who wrote to Abigail Adams about Wilson, also had read the pamphlet, the Wilson pamphlet, very closely. As for Jefferson, he actually copied out long extracts from the Wilson pamphlet. This has been known for a long time. Gilbert Chenard, Carl Becker pointed it out a long time ago. Gary Wills discussed it in his 1978 book. So this had been known that Wilson kind of was the immediate source for Jefferson's famous preamble. Okay, the part of the Declaration of Independence that everybody quotes. The rest of the Declaration dealing with the grievances against the Crown and against Parliament, that's different. That's not in the Wilson considerations, but the argument of the preamble is. All right, now, that's important. You've also got to be very careful not to jump to conclusions, not to assume that the preamble of the Declaration meant the same thing in the 18th century that it means to us. There's this very fine book by David Armitage where he points out that of the 100 or so declarations of independence that have been adopted since 1776, almost none invokes the Jeffersonian preamble. In fact, it's actually worse than that. If you start looking in detail, this really startled me, but it's true. You can now do word searches and pin this down rather exactly. Basically, nobody mentions the preamble until about the 1820s. That includes Madison, John Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and most strikingly, Thomas Jefferson. There are references to the Declaration of Independence. There are references to the grievances against Great Britain, but the preamble is not singled out as being especially important. The reasons for that, it would take too long to go into, but essentially, it's not till you get to the 1820s and just to give you the story very, very quickly, there were regular celebrations of the 4th of July, regular celebrations of the act of declaring independence. The Declaration would be read out in its entirety. The focus was on the grievances against Great Britain. By the time you get to the 1820s, the grievances against Great Britain have faded and anti-slavery becomes a big political issue, and then people start focusing on the language of all men are created equal, and they start pointing to the preamble and saying that's the core of the document. That's a 19th century view, it's not the 18th century view. Okay, that's just important background point for this next thing. If you're looking for people in the 18th century who treat the preamble to the Declaration as important, you look in the ratification debates, you can search for phrases like created equal, you get a tiny number of hits. So this is the result. You get 6 hits, most of them are trivial, except one. Okay, it's the one, just a second, this one called Convention Debates. Okay, that's from the Pennsylvania Convention Debates. It turns out it's James Wilson who quotes the entire preamble, and then he adds the remark. So this sounds very, very much like Abraham Lincoln. It says the preamble to the Declaration is the broad basis on which our independence was based. On the same foundation, the US Constitution is erected. There's nothing like that in Jefferson, nothing like that from anybody else in the 18th century. It sounds a lot like Abraham Lincoln. Wilson had done something similar, in fact, at the Constitutional Convention. He is the only one of the major founders to treat the preamble as a major statement of political principle and to link it to the foundations of the Constitution. So now there's a question that I'll leave hanging. Is there a connection between Wilson and Lincoln? That's a subject for, it's complicated, is my short answer. But all right, so let me just sum things up. Now, if you look at Wilson at the convention, he's a major figure for all the reasons that I've given you. He's also central for the Declaration, in particular for the modern conception of the preamble. Fine. Okay, so that I'd long known before 2012, but then thought, I have this. So in the Wilson archive, there is the handwritten manuscript for Wilson's Considerations pamphlet. Julian Boyd. So this is of interest for people who do archival history, who work with manuscripts, and also for people who think that manuscripts are this is just for harmless drudges and it doesn't really matter all that much. Boyd, greatest of the archival historians, in 1940, he was doing some work. He wrote an article and he said, the original manuscript is actually in the Historical Society. It was written around 1770, and somebody ought to do a careful editing of it because it's a very important text. Boyd didn't quite fully understand the importance to the preamble, but he was certainly right. The thing ought to be re-edited. He said so. He didn't do it himself. He moved on to editing the Jefferson Papers, left this as a random footnote. I had a scan done of the manuscript. So here's one page of the 29 pages of this pamphlet that turned up as a 30-page pamphlet in 1774. If you look at it, you see it's pretty clean for an 18th century text. The handwriting is quite nice. You can blow it up. You can read most of the words quite clearly. You can see what's being inserted. Here and there are some things that are scratched out. Nothing particularly striking. So, okay, and I had this thing sitting on my hard disk, and I thought, someday I'll get around to looking at all those little changes. There's no real point in transcribing it. What's that going to tell you? Wilson published it. You can see it's pretty much the same thing. 29 page published text, 30 pages of manuscript, 30 pages published, 29 pages of manuscript. It's clean. Okay. It might be interesting to look at things like punctuation, paragraphing, things like that, but most of it, look, it took me 6 months to decipher the Committee of Detail manuscripts. I wasn't up for another big task like this. It was a student of mine. I told him about the Committee of Detail manuscripts, and he was quite excited. He said, "Is there anything else like that you're working on?" And he said, "I'd love to help." I said, "Well, why don't we maybe, there is this. It's not going to yield anything, but it would be a good thing to have a transcription finally of the consideration manuscript. So let's do it." So we went back to page 1, and the way you do these things, said, "Look, we'll work jointly. I will read out what's in the manuscript. You type it in to the word processed version of the published version of Wilson's pamphlet, marking up any changes and typing in any new stuff. So we'll sit at opposite ends of the room, go back and forth 3 or 4 words at a time, paying very close attention to punctuation, capital letters, stuff like that. And we went along. You get into a kind of catatonic state where you're just reading a few words, and then he reads them back, and then move on to the next few words. And maybe an hour into it, I'm looking at this page, I noticed he was doing a lot of typing. And I said, Jack, you're only supposed to be typing in new stuff. The stuff that's clear, leave it. And he said, well, that's what I'm doing. I said, what do you mean that's what you're doing? He said, well, this is new. This is not in the published manuscript. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the past couple of sentences, completely new. And I said, how long has this been going on? I said, well, about 10 minutes. So we took a quick look. Now, as you may have noticed, so this is the manuscript page. I should mention these are big pages. These are folio pages. There's a printed page. If you compare the two, you can actually see there are many, many more words to the page in the manuscript than there are in the printed thing. It turns out that manuscript that Boyd had commented saying, it would be worthwhile to transcribe it at some point, but he thought it wasn't, he didn't want to do it. For several years, I was tossing it to one side thinking, I've got other things to work on. Basically, every major documentary scholar of the Revolution has been through the Wilson papers, has had that manuscript go through their hands. It wasn't until we actually sat down, Jack Sheehan and I, to do the transcription that we realized, actually, this manuscript is very, very much longer than what Wilson published. It's about 3 times the length. And what's really interesting, there are 2 things that are really interesting. One is when Wilson went to publish his manuscript, he cut out all the things that would have seemed like legal technicalities. So when he was writing it, he was putting in all the kind of pedantic, detailed footnotes, saying this is where this argument comes from, this is where that argument comes from. He sliced all of that out of what he published. For somebody who's interested in legal history, of course, the footnotes, the details, that's exactly what you want to see. So in the unpublished manuscript, there's lots about things like Calvin's case and the case of the ship money and English colonial policy, the conquest of Jamaica, Ireland. It's a treasure trove. Incidentally, I've asked around a lot of people. I think that's probably the most substantial manuscript discovery from the time of the Revolution by any of the major founders for probably about a century. There were some things that turned up early in the 20th century, nothing really since then except 20,000 words that bear directly on the Declaration of Independence from the person who supplied the impetus for the preamble. That's unusual. That doesn't happen every day. It's certainly not what I was expecting to find. My own view, so I'm editing this manuscript and trying to analyze it closely, but I think it's fairly easy to establish that this is the most sophisticated single legal analysis of the dispute with Great Britain prior to 1774. So if you set it beside Jefferson's summary view, if you set it beside Franklin's arguments, the closest thing would probably be the Adams, the Novanglis papers. Wilson he's in terms of the detail, the sophistication of the argument, I think he beats all of them. He also compares extremely favorable if you set him side by side with Mansfield or Blackstone. So it's a remarkable document. What's also remarkable, well, so I'm not going to get it. So there's a slightly different version of the paragraph that gave rise to the preamble, which it's got lots of footnotes and it's a complicated thing to unravel. But because time is running short, let me not go into those intricacies and instead mention something else. Remember, the pamphlet was published in 1774 when the Continental Congress was meeting. It was controversial. It was taking a very radical position, so radical that Franklin ultimately decided he couldn't afford to be associated with it. Boyd, based on some internal evidence, thought it was written about 1770. There's a note in the published version saying this was written a few years ago, and Boyd figured, okay, the date probably about 1770. That sounds about right. It's remarkably early. When you look at the manuscript, okay, this handwritten text, the internal evidence, well, it begins with something that Wilson cut, saying the following sheets were written above 5 years ago. Well, okay, that puts you back into the 1760s, and in fact, it's possible to date it rather precisely. You have to do some triangulation, but this Wilson manuscript was finished by the end of November 1768, which that's really quite surprising. And this is 3 years after. In fact, it's not even. It's about 3 years after Wilson has emigrated from Scotland. If you look at the timeline, you have Wilson emigrating in 1765. That's when the first volume of Blackstone appears. 1767, Wilson finishes up his apprenticeship under Dickinson. During the apprenticeship and just after, Dickinson was writing the Farmer's Letters, which were considered, they were the radical statement of the time. Wilson then, he read Dickinson's letters and thought, this argument doesn't work. He's not going deeply enough. Wilson then wrote the manuscript, did his analysis of what had so far appeared of Blackstone. The most important parts are volume 1 of Blackstone. And he then puts this manuscript into his desk drawer. Basically, his friends told him, look, if you publish this, you're a young man, you're in British North America. If you publish something this radical, you're going to destroy your career. So don't do it. So Wilson shelves the thing, and then 1774 pulls it out and publishes it. Now, the usual story, not surprisingly, so if you look in Balin, you look in any of the standard histories, basically the Considerations appears as a document of 1774. Okay, it appears after the revolution has been going on for some time. It was a radical document for 1774. In fact, in 1768, Wilson was very far ahead of everybody. So certainly out of Dickinson, Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, even Samuel Adams. Wilson is staking out the most radical position of anybody at the time, all of which is rather ironic if you think of the 1776 musical. Okay, with Wilson being portrayed as the coward who couldn't get his act together and couldn't be persuaded to sign the Declaration of Independence. That's a pretty substantial misunderstanding of what actually happened. Okay, so let me take a breath. This thing. So this is the famous picture, the presentation of the draft of the Declaration of Independence by the Committee of Five. Those five in the middle, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, Adams, and the rest. They are presenting the Declaration of Independence to John Hancock, who's on the right in the chair. These are in the view of John Turnbull, who painted this famous painting, which is in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. He was trying to get in all the principal figures. Where's Wilson? Well, he's the man right behind John Adams's. You see, John Adams has got his hand on his hip, and right behind his elbow, there is Francis Hopkinson. Next to him is James Wilson, and Joseph Hughes is the person looking off to our left. So you have Joseph Hughes, James Wilson, Francis Hopkinson, forgotten people by 1820 when this mural was painted. Wilson was a non-entity, just a kind of anonymous figure, not one of the people standing at the desk, long since disgraced. All of his papers, of course, they were in the hands of his son and then his granddaughter, and then in the archive of the Historical Society. So poor Wilson, he got forgotten until quite recently. Now, if you put all these things together, what do you have? Well, this is quite a surprising change from the standard view maybe a dozen or so years ago. So at the convention, Wilson he's arguably the sharpest legal intellect of the entire convention. James Madison was not a lawyer. Wilson, if you compare him with the others, look, he was the leading lawyer in Pennsylvania. He was a very, very dominating figure. The work on the Committee of Detail, there's a lot that's obscure about what happened inside the detail. Two things are certain. One is Madison was not a member. Second, Wilson was clearly a major force. What exactly he wrote, exactly how he did his work, we don't know. Design of the presidency, Wilson's the primary figure there. Ratification debates, which I haven't talked about, those are extremely important. The conception of constitutional government that he puts forward, that is, he had the clearest sense of how the Constitution actually was going to develop over the course of the 19th century. You also have Wilson in the Declaration, and this entire remarkable history of Wilson both sort of influencing Jefferson to write the preamble and also being the only major founder actually to treat the preamble as constitutionally important. And then you have this kind of new manuscript, 20,000 words, giving the intellectual sources for what he was up to when he wrote his pamphlet. Okay, so let me now kind of sum this up. This I think is defensible. At any rate, I've said it to many audiences of people who might have been expected to push back, and I've never had adequate pushback to make me feel worried. If you're looking at the leading intellects, the leading constitutional thinkers of the American Revolution, so set aside political figures, generals, or George Washington, he's not a constitutional thinker. Benjamin Franklin, very great intellect. By the time the Constitution was ratified, he was quite elderly. He's not a major influence on the American Constitution. Obviously, Franklin, Washington, they're kind of admirable, tremendously remarkable human beings, but I'm focusing now specifically on constitutionality, looking at sort of originality, the impact they had, breadth of their ideas, technical mastery of arguments, all the usual standards that you would apply when evaluating a philosopher. I'd say you end up with a list of 5 people who are rather different from anybody else. So you have the 2 great Virginians, Jefferson and Madison. They belong in a different category from, I think, somebody like George Mason or Edmund Randolph. They're important people, but they don't have the same breadth, same depth as Jefferson and Madison. Then in the north, you have the two great Federalists, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. Again, both very great, very different from Jefferson and Madison, tremendously important figures. And then you have this one Scotsman, James Wilson. Okay, that, for my money, those are the top five. It's sort of pointless to try to get into an argument about within that group of five, whom do you pick as the leader? That's not an argument I particularly wish to have. I think it's a stupid sort of argument. I do think that it's clear if you take any of these and you compare them with, for example, Dickinson, Gouverneur Morris, take your pick, any of the others. So there are a lot of people saying very intelligent things about politics, about constitutional government. None of them is in a category with these five. And I think that's the way to leave it. You've got five very interesting voices. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is those first four are extremely well known. Wilson, not at all. Okay. So now, let me just, to conclude quickly, say something about the things that I've left out. The Scottish connection, I think, is extremely important in the way that it shows up in the lectures on law. So what you've got these lectures that Wilson gave. They are, what he left is lecture notes. They're very disorganized. They're difficult to disentangle, but they do show the influence of his Scottish education, the education at St. Andrews. It's important that Scotland was a civilian legal system, not a common law legal system. Wilson was acquainted with both, but unlike most of the other framers, and incidentally, we can go back here on this list, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton were all strongly influenced by ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, though there's a subtle difference. They were taught by people who had been schooled in the early Scottish Enlightenment, who then emigrated, who were teaching in North America, in effect, the first phase of the Scottish Enlightenment. That's what Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton absorbed. Wilson, being educated in Scotland itself, at St. Andrews, possibly at Glasgow, he was getting exposed to ideas from a later phase. Adam Smith in particular. Okay, so there are a lot of extremely interesting technical questions about Roman attitudes towards property law, about rival kind of competing Scottish and English conceptions about what empire meant, about feudal tenures, about the notion of sovereignty. There's an enormous amount that needs to be unraveled, some of which I've done, some of which I'm going to need help with. There are various old-time debates, and there's this famous debate between McIlwain and Schuyler and Black about the conception of sovereignty that existed at the end of the 18th century. It's dealing almost entirely with English law. Wilson, I think, is being driven by quite different considerations. But the deepest point, I think, is this, that if you look at Wilson, if you ask, why is he important? He sits at a very, very difficult scholarly intersection point. So, and I think this is one of the reasons why, this was, Rick Beeman's comment when Rick died a number of years ago when we were talking after his book came out. So, the reason that people don't focus on Wilson is he's too difficult. People look at those lectures, they look at him and they think, move on to something that's much tidier. He incorporates both very technical 18th century philosophy. Okay, so he studied the philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment. He was trained in Reid's metaphysics. He read Hume, he read Locke. He also was trained in the technicalities of 18th century law, both civil law and common law. If you put all of those things together, it's quite a complicated picture that you then have got to try to put the thing together and sort out, well, where exactly does Wilson fit within. So look, the canvas on which you have to view Wilson is broader than just Philadelphia. It's where does Wilson fit within the broad sweep of Western legal history, Western liberal constitutionalism. He's a Scot, Scotland of the 18th century, profoundly influenced by legal ideas coming from the continent, from the Netherlands, France, Germany. You look at the authors that Wilson is citing, there are, I haven't counted exactly, but I would say there are probably more continental authors than there are English authors. Not that he was not familiar with the English authors as well. And what I think one's going to end up with is a discussion of the origins of the US Constitution that tries to embed it not in the way that it's usually seen, which is as a miracle at Philadelphia, as some dramatic set of events that happened in the 1780s in Philadelphia, but as something that belongs within a much longer, much broader Western legal tradition. Okay, so that's ambitious. That's the next step. And that's what I'm getting to now. So the next things that need to be taken care of is a really fine-grained philosophical examination of the intellectual sources for Wilson's thought, which means looking in great detail at the lectures, looking at the arguments, the intellectual sources for the Considerations manuscript, both of which point to St. Andrews in two different ways. So St. Andrews, because that's where Wilson got his ideas in the first place, but also because you have this sort of wonderful group that is investigating exactly these sorts of things now. So I will end there. Thank you very much. I'm ready for questions. Tony, are you able to? How do I shut down?
Yes. So thank you, Bill. Let me just first say thanks. That was an outstanding first lecture for us in the Wilson lecture series. So you've done exactly what we have, and you've pointed us to, I think, some fascinating questions and issues. So there are some questions coming up. Please let me just remind you, if you do have a question for us, to post it in the chat, and then I'll read them out, and then I'll push them in so that everybody can see them, but I'll also read them out. But I'm going to cheat first. I'm going to ask a question first. I'll take the chair's prerogative.
Sorry, should I hit the stop sharing button? I'm not. Let me try that. See if that. Okay, am I now?
So yeah, my first. So let me ask you, Bill. And for everybody to know, Bill mentioned these articles that he's written on Wilson. There's two very good ones, and they're both in the Journal of Constitutional Law, so they're worth definitely looking at. And in one of them, in the one on the Scottish Enlightenment, let me ask you, Bill, you have a quote there where you say the very fact that Wilson was an immigrant gave him a different perspective on the new nation than that of many of the founders. And you've already you said that toward the end, how that's relevant. But it is kind of interesting because there you make a slightly different point. You compare him to Jefferson, who thought of his country as being Virginia, whereas this was maybe a more nationalist kind of idea. Can you say something maybe about Wilson? Because of course that's an important part of his agenda within the Constitutional Convention. So maybe you could speak to that immigrant, not just even from Scotland, but just being an immigrant and how that impacted his ideas. If you could maybe give us some thought on that.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting contrast if you look at the leading founders. So Jefferson and Madison both thought of themselves as Virginians first. When Jefferson writes about "I long to get back to my country," he's in Washington, D.C., longing to get back to Virginia. John Adams, it's much the same way. He thought of himself as I'm from Massachusetts. Three of the founders have a notably different perspective. So one is Washington. Washington, I think, with him, that's to be explained by the fact that he led the Revolutionary Army of all these people. He was marching up and down the east coast of what became the United States, and that formed in his mind the idea there's a single country here. A second one is Hamilton, who he was also an immigrant from the Virgin Islands, and he lived mostly in New York, but he was kind of back and forth between various states. He didn't think of himself as having family in. Sorry, if I shut off my email, we will have less interference. So look, somebody like John Adams, he could think my family has been in Massachusetts for whatever it was, 5 generations, 6 generations. Same thing for Jefferson, same thing for Madison. Hamilton didn't have that. He was much more able to think of himself as I'm an American. Wilson, same thing. He thought of himself as I'm a North American, not really a Pennsylvanian. And that plays into his nationalism. There's not very much in the way of Pennsylvania chauvinism for Wilson. Anyhow, and that's my way. It's this is a stylistic thing as much as anything else, but I do think if you read a lot of these people, you do see Wilson is thinking of himself somewhat differently than many of the others.
Okay, so great, thank you for that, Bill. So I've now there's a number of questions here. I'm just going to read out, so they're in the published section, but I'll just read them out to you. Maybe you can. We'll just do one at a time. I think we've got enough time to do a few here. So can you? The first question from Andrew Nelson. Can you comment on Wilson's relationship with Robert Morris, their work that established the early forms of a U.S. central bank, and the influence Morris may have had on Wilson's future investments in Western lands that caused his eventual bankruptcy?
Okay, so several things. They were friends. They were actually quite close friends. They were nearly lynched together. So during the early years of the American Revolution, Wilson and Morris, they were both wealthy Philadelphia lawyer banker types. They were accused of currency manipulation, of being crypto loyalists, and a mob formed. It came to Wilson's house. 5 people were killed in this, gunfire erupted, and a number of people were bayoneted to death. And James Wilson and Robert Morris were nearly killed, which would have made quite a big difference because basically Wilson and Morris, they financed the American Revolution. They worked out the Bank of North America and the financing of Washington's army. The early thinking about American banking, Wilson and Morris were doing that together. I'm not totally sure myself, mostly because I haven't explored the matter in detail, who was the prime mover. I suspect Morris, but Wilson certainly knew the economic theory of the day. Incidentally, Wilson was the person who taught Hamilton about banking. There's a long manuscript handwritten in Hamilton's handwriting of his report on the Bank of the United States, which he wrote out specifically to show to Wilson, and it sits in the Wilson papers. As for the financial investments, they were both up to their ears in speculation. They both went bankrupt. They both ended up in serious trouble. Wilson was killed as a result of it, and he was imprisoned, and that led to his early death. That side of things, maybe we better say less about. It needs to show up in the biography, but anyhow, I'm sure there's more to say. That's the extent of my knowledge of that particular facet.
Okay. So now there's actually 2 questions here that are related. So I'm going to give you both of them. So they're slightly long, but I think they both they fit together well, and both from St. Andrews folks here. So first is from Rachel Hart, who's our university librarian and one of the archivists, and she has a really good question. We have borrowing registers in the university library archive, which do give evidence of what books Wilson borrowed from the library as a student at St. Andrews from 1759 to 61. But we didn't teach law. He could have got a good philosophical grounding here, but would you agree that the Scots legal training would have been delivered at Glasgow? And have you investigated what he read there? And before you answer that, a related question from John Haldane, one of our philosophy professors here. On the Scottish influence, there's good reason based on Wilson's law lecture, see, of man as an individual, works 1, chapter 6, and of the nature and philosophy of evidence, works 2, chapter 13, to think that he was influenced by Reed's Glasgow lectures on jurisprudence and principles of common sense. Do you agree? So 2, kind of asking about the Glasgow, I guess, elements of Wilson.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I know Rachel. I think we met some years ago. So yeah, she can text you or whatever. I think she was the one who put me in contact with Martin Claggett years ago. Anyhow, see if she types in something in but anyhow, yeah, so it's complicated. My initial assumption, this I got when I read the standard biography of Wilson, when I first had the idea that it might be interesting to examine him for civil law influences. His biographer said he didn't study law in Scotland. He studied law first when he got to North America under Dickinson. He was training to go into the clergy, and so there's no connection. And for a time I was disappointed, and then it's only later that I understood. Actually, the education for lawyers and the education for people going into the clergy in the 18th century, they ran in parallel. You studied the same things in your initial studies. You would study natural law, you would study natural religion, you would study principles of ethics, principles of well, in Adam Smith's lectures in Glasgow, lectures on jurisprudence, you would be studying history of Roman law, you would be studying economic development. After you had done that for a couple of years, then you would specialize. If you were to go into the clergy, you would then start learning Hebrew and you would read the Bible. You would learn revealed religion. If you were going to do legal practice, then you would brush up your Latin and you would go and study Roman law and learn the technical details. So Wilson, yeah, he didn't, as far as, it's a little bit hard to tell how much he knew about the technicalities of Scots law before he emigrated. There's some signs that he was apprenticed to a lawyer briefly before he emigrated, but it's hard to work out the specifics. What is clear is the education that he received definitely had legal implications. Okay, that there's no question about, and John Haldane is correct. There's influence of Reed, there's influence of Smith, trying to figure out what he picked up in Glasgow, what he would have picked up from his own reading in Pennsylvania. That I don't know. And I don't think the evidence lets you say for sure. What you can say is this was somebody obviously very ambitious, very, very intelligent, philosophically quite sophisticated. For 18th century North America, he was as well educated in technical philosophy as anybody this side of the Atlantic, and he kept up his interest. So even if, so let's suppose, so there's this scrap of paper that indicates that James, look, here's a problem. In the 18th century in Scotland, every third male person is named James Wilson. So if you find a scrap of paper with James Wilson's name on it in Glasgow, registering to attend some lectures, maybe that's our James Wilson, maybe it's not. That's all that we've got. If he was in Glasgow, that places him there at approximately the same time as Reed and Smith. Was Wilson sitting at Smith's feet when he was giving lectures on jurisprudence? Who knows? There's no way to tell. He'd certainly heard of both. He certainly refers to them. He certainly read their work. So yeah, that's, but.
Okay.
Okay, so I hope that answers that.
Yeah. Okay, so we have. I'm conscious of time, so we have just a few more minutes. We've got two more questions here. I'm going to pose to you, Bill, and then we'll wrap things up. So first is from Andrew. It says, "Thank you for this exciting lecture. I have a couple questions, both related. Are the arguments in the manuscript of considerations all reproduced in the printed version, or are there shifts? And what kind of sources is Wilson referencing in this manuscript?" And then a question from Brogan Tierney. Apologies if I missed this, was wondering how did Wilson and other immigrants from Britain like him avoid being considered a traitor to the British side? And again, thank you for the brilliant lecture. So I don't know if you could speak to both those. I know they're not directly related, but if you could speak to both those, that'd be great.
Yeah. So the first on the consideration. So let me, since this is a public lecture, and since I haven't actually published the manuscript quite yet, and since I put in an enormous amount of work transcribing the damn thing, let me say I will publish it, and that will give a full answer. But there are some subtle shifts. The bulk of the argument is let me put it like this. The bulk of the argument, the natural law argument, that is the same. What is different is the technical legal arguments, the references to the English sources, the footnoting, a lot of the detail. That's extremely interesting, and it takes a long time to unravel. So anyhow, I'm firmly of the view it's an extremely interesting manuscript, and it will be published as a separate kind of standalone manuscript with commentary on what Wilson was up to and a comparison with what he published. The other question about being a traitor, yeah, that was kind of a general problem for all of these people. In 1768, I think the reason that Wilson didn't publish his manuscript was it was too dangerous. It's not that he would not have been accused of high treason and executed, but his legal practice would have suffered. He was a subject of the British Crown, and to be taking the position that Parliament has no authority to legislate in North America for somebody who was look, just remember, he's 26 years old, right? He's just got his law degree. He's 3 years away from Scotland. For him to publish something like that at that time and then try to establish himself as a prominent Pennsylvania lawyer, he would have been taking his career into his hands. Probably not his life, but his career definitely. Now, by the time you get to 1776, things were so inflamed. Yeah, if the revolution had gone differently, maybe some of those people would have been in serious trouble. Maybe they would simply have been pardoned. Who knows? But you were then in a wartime situation, and Wilson, quite contrary to the way that he's depicted in the Hollywood musical, there's no sign of any cowardice. Far from it.
Okay, great. Okay, so well, I'm afraid we do have to call it bring things to a close here. And before we do, though, let me just say a couple of quick things. So first, let me say thank you to the Institute for putting on this terrific lecture. Caroline Humphreys is the director. John Hudson is the deputy director. Have helped bring this all together. The plan had been that Bill would be here in St. Andrews doing this research in person, and we were going to hear this lecture in person. So we hope that he'll be coming in the future to spend some time here at St. Andrews. So if you have more questions, maybe you'll get to ask those of Bill in person. Let me also just say thanks to the IT team that made this possible. Colin Reed, who helped manage the whole production, did a terrific job. So thank you very much. And just finally, let me say thank you to Bill for really providing us the kind of insight that I think we rarely get. There, you can't imagine there's too many more forgotten founders, but this is clearly one who deserves to be remembered, and we're looking forward to your publications, Bill, to continue to come out about him and hopefully help us understand not only the American context, but maybe even wider constitutional issues as well. So thank you very much, Bill. And thank you everyone for joining, and we hope you have a good evening.